Vue 3 is packed full of gizmos and new tools to make our applications even more powerful. As developers, the more of these features that we know and understand, the better and more powerful applications that we're going to be able to deliver. Vue 3 doesn't really have a lot of breaking changes, but since it's a complete rewrite from Vue 2, some changes are definitely going to be expected. If you have an application that is currently receiving props, attributes, and emitting events, this course is for you. Disclaimer: this course is intended for developers that already have Vue 2 experience. I'm going to assume that you already know how to make your own components for your own applications. I'm also going to assume that you are familiar with core API features such as vModel, props, events, emits, and so on. Furthermore, I am not going to cover the composition API in this course. If you need a refresher or you're completely new to the composition API, we have a great course in Vue Mastery that I really recommend that you check out first. Having said that, let's take a look at what you're actually going to learn in this course. There's a lot of exciting new features to be learned. We're going to take a look at the new defaults for binding props and emitting events. We're also going to cover multiple vModel bindings into a single component. That is actually a thing now. And later, we're going to take a look at how you can create your own custom vModel modifiers. Later on in this course, we're going to take a look at the new $sign atters. What's going to happen to your components now that $listeners is basically gone? What can you now do now that you have more control over class and style bindings? Finally, we're going to take a look at multi-root components and its caveats. What's going to happen there with attribute fall-through? Are you still going to have to use inherit atters? More on that later. Don't worry, all of these concepts are super general and can be applied to any component out there in your applications. Ready to jump right in? See you in the first lesson. Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about vModel in Vue 3. As you probably already know, vModel allows us to very quickly and easily bind an input's value to the state of our application. Similarly, when the state of the application changes, these changes are reflected into the input that is vModeled. In Vue 3, this vModel has gone through a redesign that allows us more power and flexibility when defining how this two-way binding should be done. Let's start by looking at a native input element. Here, we're going to define a simple input element. It's of the type of text. In Vue 2, whenever you added a vModel declaration to a native input element, the compiler would produce a very verbose block of code to handle the correct input value and the event to be listened to. In this example here, we're going to change the type to a variable, in this case, email. But what would happen if this type was to change at runtime to say input or even checkbox? The compiler now has to sort of guess what's going on behind the scenes. So in order to do that, it's going to create a really weird switch statement that you can now see on screen. Don't worry, we're not going to look at all this code, but it's just important that you know that the compiler needs to do all of this work just to figure out what type is going to be put into the input. I'm sure you've been in this situation before. You have a base input component, and maybe you have a property that's defining this. Well, this is exactly what we're talking about right here. In Vue 3, outputting this verbose amount of code is no longer necessary. vModel behaves almost the same way it does for a native input element as it does for a component. It just has a little extra module there to do some heavy lifting. The compiled result, in comparison, is incredibly smaller. Let's take a look at the new defaults. On the left, we're going to have a Vue 2 component, and on the right side, we're going to have a Vue 3 component. Let's first stop this out. We're going to want a template with an input element inside of it. We're also going to have a script tag, and we're going to pass some props to it. In View 2, remember, every default vModel prop was value, and the default vModel event was input. We're talking about custom components here, okay? In View 3, the default vModel prop is now model value, and the default vModel event is update model value. Now I want you to take a good look here at this model value keyword. Do you see how it's repeated here on update model value and on the prop? This is very important to keep in mind. What the new event is telling you is that it's going to update whatever the keyword that is ahead of it. So if this is model value, foo, bar, or cat, that's going to be directly related to the name of the prop. So keep this in mind. Let's go back to our example code and add some props. Let's start with View 2. We're going to add the value prop as you normally would. And then we're going to bind it to the input. Now, let's listen to the input event, and we're going to emit an input event in return. It's going to throw the event target value as the payload for this event. So far, so good. Now let's look at its View 3 counterpart. Instead of value, we're going to bind to model value. It's still going to be the type of string and number with the default of an empty string. Now, we're going to bind the value to model value. Next, let's listen to the input event. However, this time, we're actually going to emit update model value, because that's the name of our prop. These, remember, are the defaults. We're going to talk later about how we can change this. Again, we're going to emit event target value. Let's remove View 2 here for a second and focus on View 3. If this was a real component, we would name it something like baseinput.view. Now let's try to import this into an application. If we open the app.view file, we would have a template and a script. Now let's go ahead and import the actual base input component. We'll do it right here below the script tag. The next step would be to declare it in the components object. So we're going to pass base input here. Now that we have imported base input, let's put it in the template. We're also going to add a vModel binding. It's going to bind to a variable called myInput that's going to be in our state. Let's go ahead and add that as well. So we're going to have our data function, and we're going to return our object with a myInput binding. It's going to default also to an empty string. And you're probably thinking right now, okay, so this is the same thing. Well, I want you to take a look closely. This vModel declaration that you're looking at is actually now a shorthand. In its long version, vModel now takes a parameter. You separate it by the colon and you state the name of the prop that you're going to want to bind to. Notice here how model value correlates to the prop model value, and it also correlates to the input emit. So what we're telling vModel here is, hey, I'm going to bind this vModel declaration to the model value prop and to the update model value emit. This is very important, and it's going to make a lot more sense once we look at multiple vModel bindings. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about why this is important. Let's wrap it up for now. I know that was a lot to take in, but don't worry, in the next lesson, we're going to build on these concepts and everything is going to start to make much more sense. We're going to talk about multiple vModel bindings. Yes, that's multiple vModels to a single component. Also, we're going to talk about how to build your own custom vModel modifiers. See you in the next lesson. In View 3, outputting this in View In our last lesson, we went over the most common ways to use View 3 vModel in our applications. We also took a look at the default bindings for input and event listeners. These are things that you need to know in order to use vModel in View 3 more effectively. It is now time to go into one of the more advanced changes that Vue 3 brings in terms of vModel functionality: multiple vModel bindings into a single component. Let's dive right in. A really interesting part of the new Vue 3 vModel system is the ability to bind multiple vModel bindings into a single component instance. Have you ever created a complex component that emits an object as the payload? Maybe that payload inside has different properties, each one related to a different part of your component. This can get really complicated really fast. Maybe you needed this component to pass a lot of information to the parent. Wouldn't it have been easier if you could just have bound to each of these properties separately? Although this approach is fairly common, it brings a lot of overhead in understanding what exactly is happening between the relationship between the parent and the component instance. You can't really know for sure just by looking at the template what exactly is going to be in that payload. You kind of have to go into the code, read the code, and then figure out how you're going to use that information in your binding. In Vue 3, with the addition of the multiple vModel binding, a complex payload is no longer needed. Let's take a look at what we're going to be building today. Imagine this is part of a registration form. We want to allow the user to select a salutation with the select dropdown on the left and to type their name in with the input element on the right. Now imagine that these two fields are part of the same component. In Vue 2, you would need to emit an input event, and you would probably have to pass an object as a payload as we are doing here. Inside this object, we might need to bind to a salutation property that would be tied to our select component and a name property that would be tied to the input component. As the user selects something from the select box and types something into the input box, this input event would fire constantly with the updated object. Now that we know what we're building, let's dive into the code. We are going to build a salutation name component. I've gone ahead and created a salutation name.vue component inside the components folder. This is a standard Vue CLI application. On the right, I've gone ahead and stopped out a component. It has a template section, a script section with a salutations constant, a place for props and setup, and some styles that you don't need to worry about. Let's go ahead and start with the template. I'm going to add a select element that will display our salutations. For now, I'm only going to add an empty option that would be our default nothing selected option. Next, I'm going to create an input element of the type of text. I'm going to add some space here so that we can add attributes later. Let's now jump into the props. I'm going to create a salutation prop that is of the type of string and that defaults to an empty string. I am also going to create a name prop, also of the type of string, and that defaults to an empty string. The salutation property is going to be bound to the select element. The name property is going to be bound to the input element. Let's jump into the setup method and return our salutations array. I am going to use it up here in our select input to create a loop for our options, using before item of salutations, which is bound to our array. Next, I'm going to format this a little bit and bind our value to item. I'm also going to add our key attribute as is needed for before, and I'm going to bind the selected property to check that the salutation is equal to the item. Finally, we're going to interpolate the item as the text for the option. Next, let's bind the value of the input to the prop name. I know that so far everything has been pretty standard, but bear with me and you will see the results in a minute. Next, we need to add the change listener to the select element. We're going to bind it to update salutation and pass the payload event target value. Notice that we're using the update model name syntax from Vue 3's vModel new system that we learned in the last lesson. Also keep in mind that the model name after the colon, salutation, has a correlation to the prop that we created earlier. Next, we're going to add the input listener to the input event. We are going to emit update colon name and as a payload, pass event target value. Once again, notice that the model name correlates to our prop name. Our component is now ready. Let's go to app.view and set up the bindings. First, let's go ahead and import our new component. So import salutation name from the components folder, salutation name. I'm going to make sure that we also add it to the component's object declaration. Next, let's add the salutation name instance to our template. Now that everything's ready, we can jump into the setup function and create a custom form that will hold our state. For that, I'm going to import reactive from view, since this is going to be a reactive object, and I'm going to pass it an empty object. Remember that import reactive from view is part of the composition API, which is also part of Vue 3. And the reactive object is going to become our state. Now I'm going to add two properties to our state, salutation as an empty string, and name also as an empty string. Next, I'm going to return the form so that we can use it in our template. Let's go ahead and add our first vModel binding, and I'm going to add the model name of salutation. I'm going to bind this to form.salutation. This is the binding that correlates with our reactive object. Remember that the model name salutation correlates directly to the property salutation and the update colon salutation emit that we created in the salutation name component. Now that we have our salutation vModel binding, I'm going to create a binding for the name property. This time, we're going to use name as the model name, and we're going to bind it to form.name. Once again, remember, the model name correlates to the property name and the emit update colon name of our salutation name.view component. Now that our component is ready and we've set it up in our app.view, let's take a look in the browser and see the results. I've gone ahead and added a pre-tag with the output of our state, since at the time of this recording, Vue Tools is not yet ready for Vue 3. Let's try it out. I'm going to click on our select dropdown and select missions and type in my name. Everything seems to be working just fine. In this lesson, we learned how easy it is to set up multiple vModel bindings into a single component. And you might be wondering, what happened to the modifiers? In the next lesson, we're going to take a look at how to create your own custom vModel modifiers. See you there. Once again, remember that the model name. Once again, remember. Once again, remember. Once again, remember. Welcome back. In our last lesson, we learned how to create a component that is capable of multiple vModel bindings. We also used this component in our application and applied multiple vModel bindings to it. This time around, we're going to learn another advanced feature of vModel in Vue 3, how to create our own custom vModel modifiers. Let's dive right in. You have probably already used vModel modifiers before. vModel comes with quite a few out of the box. Let's take a look. Let's start by looking at lazy. Lazy allows us to listen to the change event instead of input events for native events. I'm going to create an input element and vModel it to a message variable. This thing you see here, .lazy, is the modifier. When we apply this modifier, we change the default behavior of vModel in input elements. So instead of listening to the input event, we will listen to the change event. This will make the vModel binding fire only when the change event happens in the input. Next, let's take a look at the number modifier. It will allow us to cast a valid input to a number type. If I add an input element here and vModel to number with a number modifier, what we're going to get is that if I type 100, instead of receiving a string, I will receive a number. Finally, let's look at trim. Trim allows us to trim the white space from an input. Let's add another input here with a vModel to text and apply the trim modifier. Now you can see that the space characters that surround the avocado emoji are gone. Note that all of these modifiers are still available to you in Vue 3. Let's learn how to create our own custom modifiers by building upon the salutation name component that we created on the last lesson. In our app.vue, we are applying two different vModel bindings into our salutation name instance. The first one binds into form.salutation state through the salutation property. The second one binds into the form.name state with the name property. Let's make some space here, and I'm going to add a .capitalize modifier to our component. This modifier will go ahead and capitalize the whole acronym from what we select from the select box. We are also going to add a capitalize modifier to the name binding. However, in this case, we are going to capitalize only the first letter of the string. Don't worry, we will look at how to implement these modifiers in a second. Let's first take a look at the current state of our application. This is our current application. If I go ahead and select something from the dropdown, it will be bound to the salutation state. Likewise, if I type something into the input box, it will be bound to the name. Notice that whatever I type remains in lowercase characters and the salutation is not yet modified. Now that we've taken a look at the current state of our application, let's dive into the code and actually write those modifiers. Let's start by adding the modifiers. I'm going to add one to salutation and one to name. Don't worry, we will implement them in a minute. Before we go ahead and implement the modifiers, however, I want you to take a look at this. Some things are going to happen behind the scenes. Vue 3 is going to actually inject new properties. For the salutation vModel, it's going to inject a property called salutation modifiers, which is an object. For the name vModel, it's going to inject a name modifiers property that is an object. This is super important to keep in mind. Every time we add custom modifiers to a component instance through vModel, Vue 3 is going to try to inject properties that match the property name with modifiers. Let's take a look now at the salutation name component. I'm going to scroll down to our props declaration. First, I'm going to add the salutation modifiers property. This property will have a default value of a function that returns an empty object. Next, I'm going to add the name modifiers property. This will also default to a function that returns an empty object. If you're wondering why we're returning an empty object and not an object with our modifier, don't worry, we will cover this in a second. Let's stop for a second and take a look at what's happening in app.vue. If we currently set the vModel bindings without any modifiers, The salutation modifier's prop is going to be an empty object. Also, the name modifier's prop is going to be an empty object. However, once we add our capitalized modifiers, these properties will change. Now, they will both have a capitalized equals to true property inside of them, which is what we can use later on to apply our modifiers to the binding. Let's go back to the code. In the template section of our salutation name component, we are currently listening to the change event for the select and the input event for the input. Notice, however, that we are emitting the update events directly from the template. In order to have better control over our modifiers, we're going to move these emits into their own functions. Let's go add those functions in the setup method. Before we get started, we need to receive two parameters from the setup function. The first one is props, and the second one I will deconstruct so we can use the emit function directly. This second parameter is also known as the context. Let's create an update salutation method that will receive an event. I'm going to create a variable val that will receive the event target value. And I'm also going to emit our update salutation event and pass the value to it. Next, let's add our update name method. It will also receive an event, and we will also create here a value variable that will be equal to the event target value. Just as we did in salutation, here we will emit update name and pass the value. Finally, I'm going to declare the update salutation and update name methods in the return statement so that we can use them in our template. Now that we have our functions, let's scroll all the way up to our template and change the listeners so that they use these new methods. I'm going to use the update salutation for the select and the update name for the input. One more time, bear with me, let's scroll all the way down to our setup method. So far, so good. But as you probably noticed, this is doing the exact same thing that it did before so far. Now that we have everything ready and set up, we're going to add the logic that will handle the modifiers. First, I'm going to create an if statement. We're going to check if the salutations modifier prop has the capitalized property inside of it. If it does, I'm going to modify the value and set it to uppercase. Don't forget to turn this into a let since we're changing it. Now let's do this again for the update name. We're going to check if the prop name modifiers contains capitalized. If it does, we're going to modify the value. This time, we're going to get the first character, we're going to send it to uppercase, and then we're going to append to it the rest of the string. Don't forget to also change val to let here. What did you think? Was it easy? Let's take a look at the results. We're back in the browser. This time around, however, when I click in one of our salutation options, notice how it is all uppercase. Now, if I type here my name, cat, or dog, it will be correctly capitalized. That's it. We're done. V-model modifiers can be as simple or complex as your application needs. Let's wrap it up, but before I have a quick challenge for you. Your challenge for this lesson is to add a reverse modifier to the name V-model. Notice that we're adding it by adding another dot after capitalize and adding the second modifier. What this modifier should do is completely reverse whatever you have typed. So if I type tag, I should receive cat instead. In this lesson, you'll learn how to use and create V-model modifiers for your V-model ready components. In our next lesson, we're going to be taking a look at $ attrs in Vue 3. We will talk about some of the core differences between Vue 2 and Vue 3 regarding attributes like class and style. We will also take a look at the removal of $sign listeners and what that means for us as developers in terms of component composition. See you in the next lesson. Don't worry.
Don't worry. Don't worry. Don't worry. Don't worry. Don't worry. Don't worry.
Don't worry. We will look. Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to explore the changes that Vue 3 brings in terms of $sign atters to a component. Understanding these changes is fundamental to the creation of custom components in Vue 3, as $sign atters not only includes HTML attributes like it did before, but also all of your listeners, classes, and style bindings. By learning these new concepts, you will understand how to pass down attributes into a component, but also how to correctly bind event listeners from a parent to a child component. Let's dive right in. In Vue 2, $sign atters is a property of the component Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to explore the changes that Vue 3 brings in terms of $sign atters to a component. Understanding these changes is fundamental to the creation of custom components in Vue 3, as $sign atters not only includes HTML attributes like it did before, but also all of your listeners, classes, and style bindings. By learning these new concepts, you will understand how to pass down attributes into a component, but also how to correctly bind event listeners from a parent to a child component. Let's dive right in. In Vue 2, $sign atters is a property of the component's data that includes all the attributes that are passed down to a child, with the exception of classes and styles. These last two, in particular, reside at the same level in the data object as atters. So what exactly can we find now in Vue 3 inside the $sign atters object? In Vue 3, $sign listeners no longer exists. It has been fully merged into the atters object with a few key differences. Listeners are no longer listed as the exact keyword, such as click or input as they did in Vue 2. Let's look at a few examples to clarify. Let's pretend that we have a MyButton component that we are instantiating inside of our template. We'll look at the differences of what's happening behind the scenes in Vue 2 and Vue 3. First, let's add a type of button. In Vue 2, this is going to go into the atters object. We'll get a type of button there. In Vue 3, the this.atters object will also receive the type of button. Next, let's add some event listeners, a click handler, a custom handler, and a vModel binding to value. In Vue 2, we have an object called $sign listeners, which receives these handlers, click, custom, and input. In Vue 3, we get an onClick handler, onCustom, and for the vModel, an onUpdate model value with a function. Notice how in Vue 3, our custom event is being prefixed by on. This also happens on the vModel binding. Instead of just getting update model value, we're getting on capital U update model value. This is very important to keep in mind when dealing with listeners inside $sign atters. Let's finally add a class of button and a style binding. In Vue 2, the class would be defined inside this.class and the style inside this.style. In Vue 3, the class and the style are now part of the atters. In order to better learn how to correctly bind $sign atters into a component, we're going to use a very simple wrapper input component. I've gone ahead and created the starting stop code so that we can dive right in. Here we are inside baseinput.vue. This component includes both a label and an input element. They are both wrapped up inside a parent div, as we usually would do in a Vue 2 application. But don't worry, we'll cover how to remove this unnecessary div with multi-root components in the next lesson. The label is bound to a label property, and the input element is vModel capable with the default's model value as a property and update model value as the emitted event. We can now use the base input component directly in app.vue by importing it and adding it to the template. I've gone ahead and imported here on line 14 and added the component into our template. I'm going to scroll down so we can look at the setup function. I've created a constant email. I am returning it from the setup function so that we can use it in the template as part of the vModel binding. Now that we have a component to play with, let's take a look at what happens when we try to apply a type declaration to our component's instance in app.vue. Let's add a type of email here into base input. Now let's take a look at the browser. As expected, we get the same behavior as in Vue 2. The type declaration has been set into the root div tag of the component. Let's go back to the code. If we now add a class declaration to our base input instance, we will also get the same behavior. Let's check it out in the browser. As you can see, the class thick has been applied, but it's also been applied to the div. Let's go back again to our code and bind the $atters correctly into our input element. We will do this by doing a bbind declaration into attrs. If we go to the browser now, we'll notice an interesting thing. I'm going to reload. The input element is now correctly binding our type, but also the class. Although this may not seem very exciting at face value, this is actually a huge improvement in Vue 3 over Vue 2. We can also see that the class has been correctly applied to our input element. In Vue 2, not only were the class and style tags not declared inside $attrs, they were always fixed into the root of the component, in this case, our div. In Vue 3, we can use this ability to bind classes into components without having to resort to less than ideal solutions, like creating a classes property. Did you notice one last thing? Our class and type are still bound to the wrapping div as well. Inherit attrs false is still a thing. We need to add this to our components object in order to let Vue 3 know that we're going to take care of binding everything ourselves. So let's go ahead and add it to our component. Let's go back to the code. And we're going to add inherit attrs equals to false inside our component declaration. If we check the browser one more time, now the div will not contain the bindings that we were setting for our input. Now that we have our attrs binding set up, we can take a look at how to bind the listeners into our component. We currently have our component set up to listen directly to input events through the @input binding. But sometimes we want to allow our components to respond to any type of event that the parent wants to listen to, especially in the case of binding into native input events. For example, let's go back to app.vue. We will add an event listener for blur into our base input instance that will change the value of email whenever the user blurs or taps out of the input field. Let's go ahead and add the blur listener below the vModel. Whenever the user blurs out of the input, we're going to do email equal to blur at its.cold. Let's go back to the browser and test it out by blurring out of the input element. First, I'm going to type something, and now I'm going to hit the tab key. It changes correctly. I'm going to type something again and click outside. It changes again correctly. If you have a lot of Vue 2 experience, you might be wondering, wait, how? Let's take a look in depth. In order to be able to listen to all of the listeners that our parent passed into our component, in Vue 2, we had to use beyond $listeners. In Vue 3, this is no longer necessary since everything is being bound into $attrs. Pretend that we have an application with a handful of base input components inside. Whenever one of the base inputs emits an input event, in Vue 2, it would be caught by the @input listener inside of our component declaration. In Vue 3, this remains the same. If one of our components emits blur, however, in Vue 2, it would get caught by the beyond $listeners binding. We would get a blur event here. In Vue 3, it's going to get caught by the b binding into attrs, except we're going to get an onBlur event. In Vue 2, we had to add beyond listeners into our input element to tell Vue that we wanted to delegate all of the events other than the ones that had been manually declared and therefore overridden to our parent. This will allow our parent, app.vue in this case, to handle declaring the logic for it when these events happened, like we just did with the blur listener. In Vue 3, this is no longer necessary. The moment we added our vbind attrs declaration, we also added a binding for all the listeners that the parent passed into our component. Remember, $attrs now includes all the listeners. So in this example, it will contain an onBlur declaration that holds the function that sets email to blur at its.cold. How convenient is that? If you are like me and you like to keep your bbind declaration clean and contained, let me tell you that there is a really cool way using the JavaScript spread operator that we can refactor this and get rid of the @input declaration. Let's look at that. We currently have our template inside base input set like this. Since attrs is an object, We can safely use the spread operator to wrap it inside an object. Let's go ahead and add an onInput binding. It's going to be a function that takes an event parameter, and it's going to emit update model value with event target value as the payload. We can safely now delete the input binding. Not only is this cleaner to look at, but it also makes sure that certain events like input don't get overridden by the parent. Let's wrap this up. In this lesson, we learned how to correctly bind the $adders into a Vue3 component and the differences that it has with Vue2. We also learned how to bind our event listeners, now that $listeners is merged into $adders. In our next lesson, we will take a look at single versus multiple root components and the role that $adders plays when migrating from single to multiple. See you in the next lesson. When Welcome back. In our last lesson, we learned how $atters works in Vue3, as well as the removal of $listeners. But there's a little bit more we have to clarify about attribute bindings in Vue3 before we go on. Vue3 allows us the possibility of creating components that have multiple roots or fragments. You might also encounter them as fragmented root components. In Vue2, this was not possible. So obviously, some changes to the framework and the API were needed. In this lesson, we will look at the differences between single root and multi-root components and how to transform a single root component into a multi-root component and the caveats that come with it. Understanding these changes, both in their benefits and the potential problems that you may encounter, will allow you to be able to not only write, but also debug any component regardless of the template architecture that it uses. We are going to build upon last lesson's component, base input. So if you're catching up, here's a quick recap. Base input is a single root component that is encapsulated by a div. Inside the input, we have a vbind declaration that spreads the $atters object. It also includes an onInput event listener that emits update model value to the parent. Let's scroll over to the script section. Notice that this component is using inherit_atters equals to false, so that the attribute fall through does not go into the div, but into the input where we bound through vbind $atters. Let's go check out app.vue now. In our application entry point, we are using a base input instance. Notice that we are both binding attributes such as label and type and a class. There's also a vmodel binding and an @blur event listener. Let's scroll down to the script. Inside the script, we import the component and make sure in the setup function that we create an email ref so that we can store the value of the vmodel binding. Let's go check out in the browser how it looks. The result is a plain email input field and the display of the current vmodel binding. If we go and type test@test.com, it is correctly reflected. Everything is working. Let's go back to the code. Making this component a multi-root component in Vue3 is as simple as removing the unnecessary div tag that wraps our component. Let's go ahead and make the change, and then we can check in the browser if there have been any changes. Now that the div tags are gone, let's go back to the browser. I'm going to inspect the input tag. As you can see, our base input is correctly being rendered. The bindings are still in place, and the wrapping div tag is nowhere to be found. I have good news for you. Now that we are working with multiple root components, we can completely get rid of inherit_atters. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and completely delete the inherit_atters property. Whenever we are working with multi-root components, Vue will no longer attempt to auto-inject attributes into the root node because there isn't a single one anymore. Since Vue cannot safely assume which of these multiple roots should get the attribute fallthrough, it will not attempt it at all. At this point, Vue will check your component file to see if you have $attrs anywhere in your component file. If you do, then it's going to assume that you know what you're doing, that you're going to handle $attrs and listeners on your own. If you don't, it will issue a warning. Let's take a look. Let's go ahead and take out the bbind directive for a moment and take a look at the browser to see what this error looks like. If we open the console now, we will see the warning. The warning reads, extraneous non-prop attributes were passed to the component but could not be automatically inherited because component renders fragment or text root nodes. The wording is a little confusing, but what Vue is trying to tell us is, hey, listen, you pass down some stuff like classes and attributes and listeners to these components, and I have no idea what to do with them. It is important that we know what this means in case we run into one of these warnings inside of our projects. Now that we do, we know exactly where to look for the solution. Let's put back our bbind declaration though, so that our component behaves correctly. If you were looking very closely at the error we generated a bit ago, you may have noticed that one of the warnings stated, extraneous non-emits event listeners were passed to component but could not be automatically inherited because component renders fragment or text root nodes. We're going to pretend that we have a component called Schrodinger's box.vue. Vue 3 multiple root components introduce a new data level property called emits. Let's check it out. In more intricate components where you are not declaring a bbind $attrs that functions as a catch-all declaration for your listeners, or in render-based components where your emits may be generated dynamically, Vue will complain that it cannot find a declaration inside of the component file or template for a custom component that you may be adding. In these cases, we get a new property called emits that sits on the data level right next to others like components and setup. This new property is, in its simplest form, an array. So if we were expecting our component to emit an event called peeked into the box, we could define it in our component like this, by creating an array and typing in peeked into the box. This way, whenever Vue instantiates our component, it will know that it may expect an event with the name peeked into the box to be emitted by the component. You will quickly notice that the API for emits is very similar to how you declare props. Let's take a look. A more advanced syntax, similar to the one of props, allows us to even set validators for these declared emits. By using an object format, we can add each of the emitted events as the key of the emits object. Then we can define it as null to avoid a validator, like this. We create an object, a property peeked into the box that equals null. Now, to take it a step further, let's add a validator that checks that peeked into the box event emits only dead, alive, or both. The validator function, just as the one in props, should return a Boolean value to state whether the payload is valid or not. Let's make a little bit more room here. Peeked into the box is going to equal a function with a payload. It will return true or false only when dead, alive, or both includes the payload. If the validator for the emitted value fails, Vue will issue a warning like this. Multi-root components are definitely a very welcome addition to Vue 3. It will make div nesting nightmares a lot less recurrent. In this lesson, we learn how to create and transform single root components into multiple root components, and the caveats and quirks of attribute fallthrough in multiple root components. We also touched upon an advanced topic, the emits property and its correct use. With this, we wrap up the From Vue 2 to Vue 3 course. You are now ready to leverage Vue 3's amazing capabilities. Thanks for watching. You are now ready to